Hey everyone, Jim here, and in this video, I'm going to show you to set up an Active Directory home lab. Active Directory is a common service used by most businesses and organizations around the world. By setting up an Active Directory home lab, it's a great way to learn more about the service and to improve your IT skills. In this video in particular, I'm going to be doing this within a virtual environment, specifically within VMware Workstation. I'm going to be using the latest and greatest operating systems, so Server 2022 and Windows 11. I do have other videos showing you how to get started with VMware Workstation and Windows 11 on my YouTube channel, so if you're not already sure how to do that, feel free to check out those videos, and I'll also post them in the section down below. So in order to do this, we need to be able to run two virtual machines at one time. So you need to have a host computer which can do that. Now, ideally, I'd recommend having a host computer which has at least 32 gigabytes of memory, 8 CPU cores, 100 gigabytes of free space available on a solid-state drive. And I know that seems like a lot, and it is. So if you don't have a computer that has those specifications, it's okay, you can try this with less, and your experience is going to vary. You could probably do this with as little as 16 gigabytes of RAM, but it's going to be slow. So we're going to be running two virtual machines. One's going to be the Server 2022 VM, which is going to host our domain controller, and the other is going to be a Windows 11 desktop, which is going to be joined to our domain. I already have the installation media for both of those downloaded. I grabbed them off of the Azure portal. If you don't have access to the Azure portal, you can find them online as well. Windows 11 and Server 2022, those ISOs are available on the Microsoft website. So I got those guys downloaded. And if you haven't worked with virtualization before, I do have a couple of videos posted on my YouTube channel to get started with both VMware Workstation, which is what I'm using today, and VirtualBox that you can take a look at. And those also cover how to install and get Windows 11 set up. So let's start by making my Windows Server 2022 VM. So select new virtual machine. Typical is fine. Say I will install it later. Select Microsoft Windows. And now for this, I'm going to select Server 2019, and that's because there isn't an option for Server 2022. So as Microsoft releases new versions, VMware will update their software, but it takes them some time. So if you notice that the version of operating system you're trying to install isn't in the list, try selecting the most recent or the closest version that you can. In my case, this is Server 2019. Now, I'd recommend naming your virtual machine the same name as you're expecting it to have within Windows. Typically with a domain controller, I keep the letters DC in the name. So that way, if I'm just looking at the computer name on a list as an example, it's pretty obvious to me that the server's purpose is a domain controller. So I'm going to call this InfoST-ADC. So it's going to be Information Studies Active Directory Domain Controller. So we'll name it just like that. We can leave the maximum disk space set to 60. That is definitely fine. And then we're going to customize it. Now, ideally, I'd say 8 gigabytes would be kind of on the minimum side. 16 would be even better. But if you are under constraints, if your computer at home only has like 16 gigabytes total and you have to split these up to be smaller, you could give each virtual machine like 6 gigabytes, and that would be fine. Or even 8 gigabytes, and that might be okay. Play around with it, see how far you can get. Another thing I like to change is processors. I'd recommend getting the total processor cores up to 4. You can do that by selecting 2 and 2, or by selecting 4 and 1. It doesn't matter what combination you use, but getting this number to 4 is good if your computer has at least a quad-core CPU, if not better. And then for the DVD. Now, we selected we are going to install the operating system later, so we want to make sure that we attach the ISO image. And I already have it downloaded and in this folder, so I will find Server 2022. And we are now all set. So click Finish. This is going to make the VM, and I'd recommend booting into the firmware so you can just easily or more easily try to boot off of that CD. So right-click, say Power, and say Power on to Firmware. So from here, we are going to want to select SATA CD-ROM. And when I hit the Enter key on my keyboard, this is going to go very quick. And it's going to say press any key to boot off CD DVD drive. And when that occurs, hit any key on your keyboard, and so it'll boot off of it. If you miss it, it's going to say EFI network not found. Essentially what that means is if it can't boot off the CD, it's going to try booting off of a network because there's nothing currently installed on this machine, and it's not going to work, and it's just going to ask you to restart the machine. So restart it again or power back into firmware if you need to. I'm going to attempt not to miss it. So I'm going to enter, hit enter again, and now you saw it said loading files, and we see the Windows installer starting to launch. Now, as I'm doing this, you'll notice that my cursor has gone away. If you have issues getting out of this VMware terminal, you can do Control-Alt on your keyboard, and that'll free it up as well. That's known as breaking control from the console. I'm actually just going to close out this little yellow tooltip, and we can install this. Now, if you've installed Windows before, this installation process is going to be almost identical. The installers for Windows Server and Windows Desktop are more or less the same. So click Next, click Install Now. You'll have to enter in a product key or click I don't have a product key. You'll have to accept the terms. So we'll go ahead and do that. Now, if you want to license this, you can. If you're just going to be testing this kind of temporarily, you don't have to put in a key in. So I'm not going to do that. And I will have to accept license agreement in a second. And okay. Now, at this point, you want to make sure you select a desktop experience. It doesn't matter if you select the standard version or data center version, but if you don't select desktop experience, you're not going to have a desktop. It's going to be just the command line environment. So definitely want desktop experience. Again, for the purpose of this demo, it doesn't matter whether you select data center or standard. I'll just leave data center selected with the important piece, which is desktop experience. And then we'll finally accept those terms, and then we'll say custom, and we'll say next to install it onto our empty hard drive. So this will take anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes to install. It's going to be dependent on the speed of your host computer. My computer here at home is fairly fast, so for me it'll be about 15 minutes. But even though this is going to be going for 15 minutes, it doesn't mean that we can't multitask. So we can start the next step of this as this is running in the background, and that's going to be to set up our Windows 11 desktop, which will be joined to the domain. So let's go ahead and make yet another new virtual machine. We'll say I will install operating system later. I will accept Windows 10 and later. Again, this is going to be Windows 11, so this is the closest option, so we're going to go with that one. And I'm going to call this infost-pc1. Click Next. And the reason why I'm doing this is eventually you might want to have a second PC or a third PC just for testing purposes. The home lab can be really useful for testing Active Directory configurations or Active Directory add-ins, or for doing like any cybersecurity exercises. Like if you wanted to try doing like an NTLM relay attack, this would be a really good environment to do that in. So in those cases, you need even more machines up and running, so you would have to increment it and have PC 2, 3, 4, and so on. 60 gigabytes for the maximum size of this is also fine, and we want to make sure we click Customize. So just like before, we also want to increase the memory and the CPU cores. The big difference though with Windows 11 is you need to have encryption and a TPM module installed. So we can go ahead and we can add in the TPM module right now. So clicking Add, go into, where did it go? TPM stands for Trusted Platform Module. And I can install it right now. Obviously I have to encrypt it first, which is okay. So click Close, click Finish, make this bigger. Now I will go into Edit the machine, go in and turn on encryption, and that is under, where did it go? Access control, go into encrypt, give it a password, encrypt, and now I can go into hardware and add in the TPM. And again, it stands for TPM, Trusted Platform Module. And now I might think I'm done, but there's one last thing I forgot to do, which is attaching our ISO file. And that's for Windows 11. And I can power into the firmware, right click, power onto firmware. And just like before, boot off the CD, making sure to quickly hit the enter key a second time so the installation actually gets kicked off. So this is going to be almost identical to the Windows Server installation, as you're going to see. So the amount of time that it takes is more or less the same, and this interface is pretty much identical. So click Next, click Install Now. You can say you don't have a product key unless you want to license it. In that case, put in a key. Now for this, it does kind of matter which version you select. The home versions of Windows 11 are not designed to be joined onto a domain. As I started this video, I mentioned that Active Directory is used by most businesses and organizations. It's typically not something you're going to run at your house. Unless you happen to be an IT person like myself, then you might run a domain controller, but it's typically not for home. So you want to make sure you select at least a Pro or higher tier of Windows 11. So Windows 10 11 Pro would be fine, Windows 10 11 Education would be fine, and if you have the option for Enterprise, that would be fine as well. The home version is not going to have the functionality built in, at least I don't believe it does, and I would also avoid these N versions. They're designed for the European market. So I'm just going to do Windows 11 Pro. And we're going to go ahead and select those licensing terms and say OK. Select Custom, select Drive 0, that's unallocated. And just like Windows Server, it's going to install Windows 11. And the process for this, again, will take about as much time as Windows Server did, which, by the way, I'm guessing is probably now done. Look at that. Great. So we need to now set a password for our administrator account on Windows Server. This is where things look a little bit different from Windows 11. With Windows 11, the setup process is going to be different than this. So let's go ahead and set a password. To select a more complicated password, I guess. One second. Cool. Alrighty. So here we are. Now, there are some things we're going to want to do to this. And there's quite a list of things we want to do. We have Windows Server 2022 installed, but at this point, it's kind of like a very much vanilla, unconfigured Windows Server install. And if you didn't already know this, Windows Server by default is kind of like a very vanilla, empty operating system. And by intention, Microsoft doesn't put a lot of tools and utilities on Windows Server by default, unlike what it does for Windows 11. So you're not going to find like the Xbox app installed in here and the Weather Channel app. That stuff is not going to be in here by default. By default, the Windows Server is like a very kind of stripped down operating system. But the cool thing about that is you can take Windows Server and you can turn it into a fully functional web server, or a domain controller, or a DNS server, or whatever you want. So there's a lot of really cool things you can do to take this very vanilla blank operating system and change it into whatever, or better customize it and convert it to be a best server for whatever your needs are. So right now it's pretty empty, pretty blank. So we need to essentially prep the server to become a domain controller. So what we first want to do is install VMware Tools. So to do that, you can right-click on your server and say Install VMware Tools. What this is going to do is this is going to allow your virtual machine to, I guess, work better as a VM. Without VMware Tools installed, it's going to make it difficult to copy things between virtual machines or copy things onto your host computer or copy and go back and forth. It adds a lot of nice quality of life improvements and also helps with scaling and resolution, which is going to be the biggest help, I think, for this video, as you're going to see. So I said install VMware Tools, and now this pop-up had popped up. So I can click on that. I can say run. And this is going to start the VMware Tools installer. Okay. So you can just click next, 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 and install. When this is done, it is going to ask you to restart the server, but you just want to abstain from that for a minute because there's going to be a couple other things you want to change before we reboot this device. Otherwise, we're going to be rebooting this like 10 times because pretty much every step we're going to take here is going to require a reboot. So I want to try to avoid the reboots if I can, just to save us a little bit of time. Oh, and there we go. So you can see now how the resolution is like 100 times better already. It just automatically filled in my empty window within VMware Workstation. So I'll say no to the reboot. I'm going to close that out. And the next thing I want to do on this guy is change the computer name. So if you search for PC name or name, it'll probably come up with view PC name on Windows settings, which is great. And you want to rename this PC. By default, Windows tends to give very generic computer names, and it's not going to make any sense to anybody else that's looking at devices on a network. So you want to give it a meaningful name. So I'm going to rename this, and my general recommendation is typically to name your virtual machine the same name as what it is in like VMware or VirtualBox. So I will copy that name of info st-adc and click next. And we'll give it a second. And again, this is going to want us to restart. I'm going to once again just say restart later. All right, so now the next thing we want to change. Now, this domain controller is going to also act as a DNS server. It's going to hold essentially a fictitious domain for a domain name that doesn't exist. So we need to have DNS services running on this. And what that means we're going to have to do is we're going to have to point our computers, the PC1 or PC2 or whatever computers that are joining this to the domain, we want to make sure that they're pointed to the server for DNS services. Now, by default, most computers are going to be set to use DHCP. And generally that's fine, but if you're a domain controller and you're serving out DNS, you don't want your IP address to change randomly because it will break your network. So you want to set a static IP address. So now to do that, we can do that within Control Panel. And you can go into Network and Internet, and we can adjust it from DHCP, and we can set a static IP address. The issue, however, is because we're running this within VMware with a NAT configuration, is we don't know what IP address we should use. So what you can do is open up the command prompt and run ipconfig. And you can see this is on a 192.168.75 network, and the default gateway is 75.2. So what I'm going to do is I'll just keep it the same IP address that it currently has, so 192.168.75.130. And I'm going to go in and set this to use a static IP address. Now, you don't want to copy my IP address. You want to make sure you check to see what network your machine is configured to be on, because yours might not be a 192.168.75 network. It might be a 192.168.55 network. You don't know. And if you type in an IP address that's not going to work for the network configuration, well, this whole thing is not going to work. And again, the default gateway, you might be tempted to do 192.168.1.1. That's not going to work. And then you might be thinking, okay, you're right, it should be 75.1. And I'm going to say that's still not going to work. You want to pay very close attention to how your configuration is set up. And the default gateway should be 75.2. So just like that. And you would want to set this DNS server address now to two different things. You first want to set the primary address to be 127.0.0.1. This will tell the server to reference itself for any DNS query. So when you are querying this fictitious domain we're going to set up, it's going to be able to resolve from itself. So we're going to leave that to the local loopback address. And then for the second one, I'd recommend just setting a public DNS server so you can just query just general things on the internet. So like quad 8s, 8.8.8.8, which is Google's DNS server. Okay, so at this point, we are ready to reboot this machine. So I'm going to go ahead and restart it. There's also some other things you could do at this point as well. If you wanted to like enable remote desktop, you could do that, or anything else you wanted to do on the server, you could definitely do that. So this is going to go and restart, and when this is rebooting, we'll let that happen, and we're going to hop over to our desktop computer. So this is that Windows 11 computer we had just set up, and it's ready to have the configuration finished. So we can go ahead, and this is going to be a new interface for those of you that haven't set up Windows 11 before. This has actually been changed quite a bit from Windows 10. So click yes. I'm in the US, so I'm clicking yes. Obviously, if you're somewhere else in the world, feel free to complete this with whatever information makes sense for you. And it is kind of nice that Microsoft will check for updates as you're installing the OS, because a lot of people have old or stale installation media, so this is kind of a nice perk. Let's give it a second or two for it to query Windows Update. And all right, so that step actually took about 5 minutes to complete. I just paused the video as it was getting the updates ready, and we're now at this screen. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up for worker school. Now you might be tempted to say set up for personal use, but because we're going to be joining this to a domain, which is typically used for enterprises or for work, we're going to select this option. So click Next. And Microsoft has been really pushing their Azure services, having everything cloud connected. And cloud is obviously the future and yada, yada, yada. However, because this is a lab environment, I'd recommend not attaching this to a Microsoft account unless you are testing things with Azure Active Directory or similar. So to get around this, what you can do is say sign-in options, and then say domain join instead. And then we're going to give our account a name. So I'm just going to give an account. I'll put in my name. So I'll do Jim. And I'm going to create a password. And we have to create security questions, of course. I hate that it has you do the security questions when you make a local account like this, because I really never pay attention to the security questions or use them. And this local account is going to be more or less not needed after we get this joined to the domain. Okay. This a little bit bigger for y'all. And you can choose your privacy settings. I'll just leave this as is for now. If this was a real computer, I might decide to carefully read over those and probably turn most of them off. But this is fine, again, for a lab environment purpose. So it's going to check for updates once more and then restart, and it's going to boot into the login screen for us. Now, this process is known as the first time login. The first time you log into a system, it's going to take a little bit longer, and that's because it's going to essentially create a profile for you on the system. It's going to take a default template and make a copy of it. And this template is usually a couple of gigabytes in size. So when it does it, it's going to be a little bit slow for the first time you log on to a system. But the second, the third, fourth, fifth, however many times you log in after the first time, it generally is faster, unless your profile gets corrupted or deleted, or if something else happens to it, then it has to recreate it. So I'll just let this go for a second. And as it's running, we can just hop back over to our server, and we can just continue work on that over here. So our server is going pretty good. We have a base server 2022 installed, and we have now the IP address and DNS configured with a valid PC name. So what we're going to do is log into our domain controller. And we're actually going to make it into a domain controller. I think, as I mentioned before, by default, server 2022 is very vanilla. There isn't really anything installed on this, very plain. So we can convert this into a number of various servers. The way that you would typically do this, especially for Microsoft services, is you would use this server manager. This essentially allows you to take this blank install and convert it into something that is more useful. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on Add Roles and Features. And this is the area where you can choose to turn your domain controller into, or change your Windows Server into a domain controller, or change your Windows Server into a database server, or whatever you might be potentially trying to accomplish. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next. This is going to be role-based, and we're going to be doing it on this physical local server. We're going to select this server. And here are all the various things that you can install. There's a lot in here, and it might not be very obvious what all these things are supposed to do. After you get more and more experience in the IT field, this stuff will become more obvious. The one that you're going to want to install to get Active Directory working is the Active Directory Domain Services. So you click on this, And it's going to say, hey, in addition to installing that, we also need to install these other things. Do you want to continue? And you want to say yes, add features. So then click next, click next, click next, not next, but install, and it's going to install that role. So this is going to take a few minutes, probably like 10 or 15 minutes. And once this is done, it's not quite installed yet. So the server will be converted into a domain controller, but it's going to be, once again, an unconfigured domain controller. So we actually have to either join it to an existing domain, and we'll talk more about that in a minute, or you're going to be able to create a new domain, which is what we're actually going to do. So as this is running in the background, I'm just going to hop back over to our Windows 11 desktop, and let's just see how we're going. So as you can see, we have now been dropped into the Windows 11 desktop environment. And we are pretty close to being able to join this thing to the hypothetical domain we're about to set up. But there's going to be a couple other changes we have to make. So just like our domain controller, we're going to, number one, want to change the computer name. And then number two, we're going to want to set the DNS on here to point towards the domain controller that we are currently configuring. So let's take care of the computer name first. Just like Windows Server, you're going to go into the search bar and just type in computer name. And the view your PC name box will pop up within Windows settings. And you can change your computer name from this generic desktop name to something more meaningful. And again, my recommendation is to follow the name of the virtual machine. So InfoST-PC1. As usual, it's going to ask us to restart. And we're going to say no. Then we'll configure the DNS address. So we're going to set this to be over here. And for this, we don't need to set a static IP address. So it's fine to leave this top option selected to automatic. But for this bottom one for DNS, we are going to set this statically. So you want to put in the IP address of whatever your domain controller is. And ours, if you remember correctly, is 192.168.75.130. And I'm going to double check that, because if this is wrong, it's not going to work. It's not going to be able to contact or resolve our domain over DNS. Let's open a command prompt and just do ipconfig. Double check that, and it looks good. And just like for our domain controller, I'd recommend setting the second address to be something that is resolvable to the internet. So like Google's 8.8.8.8. For Google's DNS services, close and close. Okay. So we're just about done. There is one other thing I forgot to have us do, which is install VMware Tools. So you can right click and say install VMware Tools. Or since I have this dialog box up, I can just click install VMware Tools right there. And just like before, we are going to go in here and install VMware Tools. And I will mention, as you're setting up these machines to test, it's really, really important that any account that you create has a password. Because if you try to set up the Active Directory domain services on a domain controller with an account existing that doesn't have a password, it's not going to work. I've done this before where I'd set up a Windows Server domain, a Windows Server domain controller, and I would make the admin account without a password just out of habit, just because I was trying to be quick and dirty just to get this thing up and running to test, and it does not work without a password. So make sure you set passwords for all of your local and domain accounts. Otherwise, you're going to run into issues. Cool. Okay, so click next, next, install, and just like with our domain controller, the install process will take just probably a minute or so, and it's going to ask for the restart. Because this is the last thing we need to install on here, we can go ahead and give it the reboot when it requests it, and we'll let this reload back into Windows 11. And all right, so installation just finished. And now we can give it the reboot. So that'll take just a second, and as that's happening, we can hop back over to our domain controller. And as you can see that the domain controller has been installed. So now our Windows Server is now a domain controller, but it is still unconfigured. So the way this works is most organizations that run Active Directory, they're not going to have just one domain controller. They're going to have multiple. And the reason for this is if your domain controllers go down, then no one is going to be able to authenticate or log on to most things on a network. So you can imagine that would be like a really, really bad outage if your domain controllers went down. Folks wouldn't be able to log on to computers. They wouldn't be able to print. They wouldn't be able to log into websites. Pretty much the entire network would be down if your Active Directory environment goes down. So what most organizations will do is they will have at least 2 domain controllers. And these domain controllers will replicate with one another. So if you need to do maintenance or if there's an outage, you can safely take a domain controller offline, and that second one will still be online to handle any of those authentication requests and to keep the domain up and running. Additionally, most companies will also have domain controllers at remote locations. So if you think about something like a bank where you have lots of branch offices, a lot of times they'll have a domain controller at that location, because if there is connectivity between a branch office and a headquarters, that would also prevent anybody at those branch offices from being able to log into anything if the network goes down between them and their branch office. So in order to improve redundancy and reliability, IT folks will oftentimes put a domain controller at those branch offices. So if there is any internet issues or general network issues between them and their headquarters, they can still log on and do work. That being said, for home lab purposes, to get up and running, just having our one domain controller is fine. But the reason why I explain that is you're going to have the option now to either take this unconfigured domain controller and join it to an existing domain, which is what a lot of people will often do, or you can create a new domain, which is a little bit uncommon because most people have a domain and they just have one domain, and once it's set up forever. So this is something you typically would do like in a home lab, or if you have the pleasure of starting a new domain for a business, which would be kind of cool to be able to do. Now, to do this, in your server manager, you can go ahead and click on this little exclamation mark where it says we have a notification, and then say, promote this server to be a domain controller. When you do this, as you can see, you can create a new domain, or you can add it to an existing domain or forest. And this can also get a little bit more complicated because instead of having just one domain within a company, you can have more than one domain. And a good example of this is, let's say I work for Milwaukee Tool. And let's say Milwaukee Tool buys out DeWalt. So both huge companies, one company is going to assume the other company. What happens to DeWalt's Active Directory environment? Well, you could move everybody from DeWalt into the Milwaukee domain, but that would be a huge process that would take a long time and be very complicated. So what a lot of companies will do is they will essentially keep both domains around. So you might have a company that has 2 domains from 2 different eras or purposes, but they're going to be under the same roof, and that's called a forest. And we've also seen this done oftentimes at school districts where each school might have their own domain, but maybe the district has a forest. That's another common way to do it. So there's different ways you can structure it. What we're going to do is we are going to create a new domain. So we are going to add a new forest. And for this, I'd recommend keeping your domain name the first part of whatever you had named your server and your desktop computer. So I'm going to call this the InfoST domain. So InfoST. And if you own an actual domain, like if you go to a domain registrar like Google Domains or GoDaddy or Network Solution, and you buy a .com or .org or whatever, you could use a real fully qualified domain name that's resolvable on the internet for your actual domain name. But that can create some issues, and it can be tricky to manage, and it costs money. So for home lab purposes, so for learning, I'd recommend just creating a fictitious domain that doesn't actually exist. So I'm going to call this infost.local. .local is a TLD or top-level domain name that is oftentimes used for testing. It is not something that's actually going to work in the real world. So I'm going to go ahead, and click next. I lost my wizard box. Where did it go? I'm just going to minimize that. Here it goes. Okay. So click next. At this point, this will take just a second or two, which is fine. And we are going to just leave this alone. This functional level would be as if you were trying to decide if you were going to add this into another domain. If you're going to add another domain controller into an existing domain, you can decide at what level your domain is going to operate at. This is important because let's say you have a domain with 50 domain controllers. This could be at a large company. It wouldn't be unreasonable to have 50. It's a lot, but it's possible. You can only operate your domain at essentially the highest level of your oldest operating system. So if we're setting up a server 2022 domain, but we still have any server 2016 domain controllers laying around, the highest operating level we can run at is going to be Server 2016 until they're all done. And after that, we can move then to a higher level. So I'm going to leave it just at 2016. That's actually the latest. They haven't made a whole lot of changes. They used to change it like every major OS. Thankfully, they have stopped that. So I'm just going to leave this as is for now. And you do need to create a password. And it's important you don't forget this password. Typically, I would name this password or make this password the same password as my admin account. That's kind of bad security practice. In the real world, you wouldn't want to do that. You would want to make it something different. But that's what I'm going to do. So do that. I might have had a typo there. Let's see if it accepts it. Cool, and it did. All right, so then click Next. This will take a second as well. You can just wait for your NetBIOS name to pop in. And I would recommend not changing it, just leaving it to be as the default, InfoST. And for the pass, we're going to leave this alone as well. Now, there's a reason why you might potentially want to change this. So bigger companies that have, hundreds of thousands of users, lots of scripts, add-ons, and such within their domain, you might start to fill up these directories. This is essentially where the database for Active Directory is going to be stored. And this, by the way, will be replicated to other domain controllers. So you could have an issue if, number one, your hard drive was not large enough. Like let's say you had a domain controller that had multiple drives. If you're storing these database folders and files on your C drive and that fills up, well, that's going to cause an issue for your domain controller. So you might want to be mindful about where you're putting this. You could allocate it to like a different external drive or some faster storage because these files are going to be extremely important that are going to be located in these folders. But for home lab purposes, I'm fine just to leave these as they are. Next. And you may see some warnings in here, and that's okay. The warnings are generally nothing you need to worry about. But if you see any errors, those are going to be things you want to address. So let's just take a look to see what happens. Again, some just general warnings, which are fine. So I'm going to click Install. Okay, and it is starting. We have a couple more warnings here, but that's okay. And as per the usual, this process will take another 10 or 15 minutes. So we're just going to let this run once again in the background, and we're going to move back over to our Windows 11 desktop, and we'll just see how it's going, and we can continue the process in here. So with our Windows 11 desktop, at this point, you're going to want to log in as your local account. And you're going to want to make sure that your DNS server is still set to point towards the domain controller. Occasionally, those network settings will get reverted or reset. That's going to be a problem. In the real world, if you're going to set up a domain controller for like a company or a business, your actual real DNS server within your organization would handle this. So your computers would just automatically have those DNS information. But again, being a home lab, we're going to kind of set things up kind of in a shoestringed fashion. So just doing an ipconfig/all just to make sure that our DNS servers are set correctly. So here is our first record, which looks correct, and our second record, which is great. So this looks good. And this is now ready to be joined to the domain, but our domain is not quite up and running yet. So we're just going to hold off on our Windows 11 box for a little bit longer and move back towards our server. It looks like it's automatically restarting on its own, which is fine. So we'll let that go for a second or two yet. This restart, I think, should be relatively quick, but it might go into a Windows Update looking screen. And that might take, once again, another few minutes for that process to finish. And I keep saying this, but again, really, the more memory and the faster processor and hard drive that you have on your host computer, the faster that this is going to take. So if you're trying to quickly learn, having a fast modern computer makes that process a lot easier. I can't tell you the number of students that I've talked with that have, either only like access to a Chromebook or like a 10 or 15-year-old computer. And I know finances can be tight, but it just makes learning so much more difficult and challenging and just takes so much longer. So if you do have the funds to buy a nicer computer to learn this stuff, I would definitely recommend it. And this is that Windows Update looking screen, as I was mentioning. Again, probably 10 or 15 minutes at most. Maybe faster if you have a nice computer. So I'm going to just pause my video here for a second as this finishes installing the computer configuration, and I'll let you know when that's done, and we'll jump back to it. Okay, so that ended up only taking, I would say maybe like 2 or 3 minutes to finish. So at this point, I can sign back in. And you're going to notice a change. So what looks different here is we have infost/. And if you ever see this as you're trying to log on to a Windows system, this would typically be a good indication that the system you're trying to log on to is on a domain. This is the domain name, infost. Our domain name is officially infost.local, but Microsoft will often just abbreviate it, infost, or whatever the main part of your domain actually is. So if you forget what the main part of your domain is, if you needed it, you can go into Other User, and then if you say, how do I sign into another domain? This may sometimes tell you, if I click in here too, if I go into /, it may tell you what the actual full domain is. Looks like it's not doing it right now, which is fine. But anyways, so I'm going to sign in with my admin password that I had set. This is the password you had set as you were creating your admin account in the Active Directory setup. So I believe that is my username, and we are now on our domain controller. Just like with our Windows desktop, I'm going to actually just double check my DNS settings on here. Sometimes those get changed as well. After this is up and running, you don't have to worry about it changing as often, but when you convert things to be a domain controller, sometimes it'll mess with the DNS settings as well. So if you do ipconfig/all, that will tell us that we have our DNS server. And as you can see, it looks like it kind of messed up things because our DNS server currently only has localhost listed, and we really want an external DNS server as well. So that way, if we need to query a real website on the internet, we'd be able to do that. So as usual, just go into Control Panel and go into the Network and Internet and find your network adapter. I'm going up right there and right there. And this is going to be pretty easy to fix. And I don't know why I cleared it out, but we just add back in 8.8.8.8. Perfect. Okay. So now that we have made this into a domain controller, I'll explain how you can actually manage the domain. If you click on this Start button here, you're going to find Windows Administrative Tools. And these are tools that when you install the Active Directory domain services and promote or configure a domain controller to be a member of a domain, that's when these are going to show up on the domain controller. Now, most IT professionals don't connect directly to a domain controller to manage it. Instead, they're going to manage it remotely. So you can also install these tools on a computer. So if you're an IT administrator, you can install these right onto your Windows 11 desktop, and you can remotely connect to your domain. But because this is a home lab, we're just going to open up these tools and use them directly on here. And as you can see, there is a lot in here. Active Directory is a huge service that has a lot of potential, a lot of different things you can run within it. I will mention though, I'll mention probably the 3 most important. So first off, we have Active Directory users and computers. We have DNS. And we have group policy. I think of those as kind of the three most important parts of Active Directory. So when we installed Active Directory domain services, it wasn't just Active Directory, but a whole bunch of other stuff also got installed. A good example is a DNS service that also got installed as well. So this is using Microsoft's DNS service. If you wanted to, if you already had a DNS server running at your company or within your organization, you could use that instead. You don't have to use the built-in Active Directory DNS just because Microsoft installed it and wants you to. You could offload it to somewhere else, but that's on here. Within Active Directory users and computers, this is where all of the user accounts and all the computers that are joined to the domain are going to be kept track of. By default, you don't see any computers in here because this is an empty domain. By default for users, though, you do see quite a few things. You see users here and then all these different groups down here. There are a couple of different groups that are created by default by the domain, and these are for various purposes. But the only active user that's actually able to do anything currently is our admin user that is right here. And then finally, we have group policy. This is really important because this allows IT administrators to control how devices operate on a network. Like as an example, if you've been into a computer lab or a public library, you'll notice that oftentimes they're fairly locked down. You can't do things like change the wallpaper, install software. Those things are restricted. And the way that those restrictions are oftentimes handled is by group policy. Within group policy, you can do pretty much anything from like lock users out of access to the control panel to set a specific wallpaper. There's a lot of functionality in here. Pretty much anything you can control or configure via the control panel, you can configure via group policy. Now, as I say this and I explain all this, all these different things that you're seeing within these control panels, these are all referred to as objects. So we have a computer folder object. This is known as an organizational unit. We have user objects, such as administrator. We have group objects, such as this group down here. And these objects can be created and serve different purposes. To do that, you can just right-click, and you can say new, whether you want a computer, a group, whatever it might potentially be, and you can make things in here. We will go back into this in a little bit, but I don't want this video to get too long, so I'm not going to do a deep dive in Active Directory today. This video is more or less just to get your home lab up and running. So I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of some of those things. Now, let's go ahead and we're going to join our Windows 11 computer to this domain. So to do that, what we need to be able to do, number one, is we need to make sure that we can resolve our domain controller from this computer. This is made a little bit more complicated because we're using a fictitious domain, infost.local, that isn't actually resolvable outside of our home lab. So this is where a lot of people have issues. But let's give it a try. So what I'm going to do is try to make this a little bit bigger so it's easier to read. And I am going to try to do NSLOOKUP, which is going to allow us to test our DNS capabilities to resolve infost.local. So as you can see, this is a good sign. We were able to query it, and I was able to return its IP address, which is great. And we might even be able to ping it. So let's try it. Ping infost.local. So that's great. We get a reply. Now, if you can't ping it and you can't resolve it, well, you could just have a weird firewall issue. So you could take a look at your firewall configuration. But realistically, most of the time when I've seen issues, it's because DNS isn't working. So double check DNS, make sure it's working. Active Directory is very reliant on DNS. So to join this computer to a domain now, you can search for domain, and it's going to say access work or school. So feel free to select that option. We are then going to connect this to work or school. You are going to join this to a local Active Directory domain. Microsoft really wants you to use their online Azure services. So we're going to say, we're just going to bypass all that. And now we can type in our domain name. So infost.local. So again, if you get an error message at this point, it's because DNS isn't working, is I would say the most likely scenario. So feel free now to type in administrator and the password that you had set. And go ahead and say make administrator and administrator. And restart now. And now our computer will be joined to the domain. And I'll mention that restarting your computer is a necessary part of this. If your computer doesn't restart and you try to start managing it from the domain, it's not going to work. That restart is absolutely necessary. So this will happen pretty quick. And when it comes back online, you are now going to be able to sign into this machine using a domain account. And this is, again, how most people will use computers in businesses. If you go to like any computer at our university, as an example, you could sign in any computers using your university credentials. You don't have to have an account for every specific computer. Same thing at your place of employment. I bet if you work at a big company, you could sign into most computer just by sitting in front of it and typing in your company's credentials. Domains provide a lot of the functionality to be able to allow you to have one set of credentials and have it work anywhere. So if I were to try to log into our Windows 11 computer using the domain credentials for administrator, it's going to work. Just like that, it's going to allow me to log in to the workstation. As I mentioned, though, this process will take just a second or two for the first time login. It's going to be a little bit slower, and any subsequent logins will be faster. Let's give it a second to finish. And here I am. So I'm just another user now on this system, and I can do things like make folders and files, and I can do whatever I want. And I could log into any other computer that's attached to this domain and do whatever I want as well. So as an example now, I'm just going to sign off of here. So what I'm going to do is, within our domain now, I'm going to go into Active Directory users and computers. And when I click on this computers organizational unit, that's what you call a folder within here. It's called an OU, or organizational unit. You're now going to see, if I hit the F5 button, my computer that shows up in here. So I can do different things with it. In addition, I could also create additional user accounts. So I'm going to actually make a new user account. So right click, and I'm going to say new user. And I'll make a user for, let's pretend my wife, Claire, is working at InfoST. So we can do Claire, C-L-A-I-R-E, okay, Schultz, and our ePanther ID, CD Ehlers. And from here too, you can give some other options. So a lot of times IT staff will set a password, and they'll say, okay, here's your password, and you have to change it after you log in, because I don't want to know your password. And the user will say, okay, yeah, no problem, I promise I'll change it. And they take their temporary password and then promptly keep it and use it forever. They don't actually change it. So you can force people to change their password at next login. You can create accounts that are currently disabled, so you can unlock them later for like future purposes. You can create accounts that can't change their password, or where the password doesn't expire. This would be helpful for a user account, just as some examples. So you can also set password requirements as well on your domain. These are configured in group policy, so by default they're quite strong. So I'm going to set a stronger password here. Still not strong enough. Okay, I'll try it once more. And I'll make it so I don't have to change my password when I log in next time. Passwords do not match. Jeez. I swear, like, passwords are like the bane of like most people's existence. Okay. Yeah, there you go. So now I made an account for Claire, and if Claire wants to log on to this computer we have now on our domain, she can log on to not only this computer, but any other computer. And it's pretty straightforward to do. You just click other user, type in your user's username, and I can log in as Claire. So let's say for whatever reason Claire wanted to change her name. So if you wanted to do that, you could also do that quite easily too centrally. So if you ever had to call your IT help desk and they had to help either change your password or reset your name, they're probably doing it through Active Directory users or computers. You can go in here and set a new password or change things like a name. And as you go in here, you're going to see a lot of different fields for a lot of other information. So Active Directory, by default, or kind of from the beginning, is meant to be a directory service. It's meant to keep information about employees and personnel. So this has information to keep track of not only like username and password, but also things like office location, email address, web page, telephone number, and much, much more. All this stuff can be stored within Active Directory. In fact, if you go into here and enable the advanced features, and you were to then go to look at an account, like let me see if I can pull up Claire once again, or even this one's fine, you're going to see there's even more stuff now you can get to, more details. And if you go into Attribute Editor, where did it go? At least I thought it was somewhere in here. Attribute Editor, right there. You can see these are all the various fields that can be stored in a user object within Active Directory. There's a ton of stuff. Most of these by default are not set, but there's a lot of stuff in here. It keeps track of a lot of stuff. And this can be really useful because even things like last login, as an example, are tracked. So right here, as you can see. This is helpful from an IT perspective. Is let's say someone's like, yes, I've been showing up at work every day at 8 a.m. and working. And let's say you have a supervisor that has suspected that a person was not actually showing up to their office on time. You could look to see, okay, well, when did they last log in, right? And you could see, well, was it at 8 o'clock or was it some other time? So that information is helpful to have in here. Same thing for computers as well. There's a lot of good attributes in here as well. If you wanted to know, like, has anybody used this computer in the past year? You could see the last person that logged into it, or the last time period, what operating system is being ran, a lot of other valuable things as well. So in order to keep this video, I think, to a more reasonable length, I'm going to wrap it up for now. My hopes is eventually I will have a video kind of going over the basics of Active Directory. So we'll dive more into things like group policy and managing computer objects. But that'll be for another video. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like it, feel free to give it a like, subscribe to my YouTube channel, sign up for notifications by clicking that bell icon. And as always, just feel free to let me know if you need anything or have any questions, and I will talk to you later.